In the quiet streets of Spencer County, Indiana, a single knock on a front door changed everything. What followed that July afternoon in 2001 will become one of the most disturbing Indiana true crime stories ever told: the rape and murder of 15-year-old Stacy Payne. The tragedy shattered a family, shook a town, and ignited a 24-year battle for justice. At the center of it all was Roy Lee Ward, a man whose name became forever tied to the darkest corners of Indiana's history. From the moment of his arrest to his final day on Indiana's death row, every stage of his journey exposed the raw tension between punishment and mercy, between law and humanity. Courtrooms, appeals, and Indiana Supreme Court rulings turned this murder case into a 2-decade fight that tested the limits of the death penalty system. Reporters followed every update. Families relived every wound. And when the execution date, October 10, 2025, was set, Indiana prepared for a moment it had waited years to witness. This is not just a story of crime. It's a story of consequence, of how one violent act echoed across time, shaping the very meaning of justice in Indiana. Before we begin, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel, because what happened in those final 24 hours on Indiana's death row will leave you questioning what justice truly means. On July 11, 2001, 15-year-old Stacy Payne was attacked in her home in Spencer County, Indiana. The horror of her last moments, raped and murdered, shattered a quiet community and launched a relentless search for justice. Investigators discovered evidence that would eventually point to one man, Roy Lee Ward. Ward was arrested not long after the crime. The weight of suspicion, the grief of Payne's family, and the urgency of law enforcement turned local headlines into statewide obsession. Every new detail inflamed public emotion, questions of safety, innocence, and vengeance. For the Payne family, the days that followed were unbearable. Their hopes for justice collided with the slow mechanics of the criminal justice system. As investigators unspooled the story of that fateful night, the community braced itself for a trial that would test Indiana's resolve on capital punishment and the limits of forgiveness. What emerged in court will horrify jurors, but also trigger legal fights that would stretch over decades. In 2002, the state of Indiana brought Roy Lee Ward to trial for the murder and rape of Stacy Payne. Prosecutors laid bare gruesome evidence: the attack inside the Payne home, forensic proofs, eyewitness accounts, and the violence of the assault. The courtroom was filled with tension as the victim's family faced the raw pain all over again. Ward's defense sought to challenge aspects of procedure, dehumanize him, and argue mitigating factors. But the facts weighed heavily. The jury, after deliberation, found Ward guilty on all counts. In the sentencing phase, they recommended the death penalty. The trial judge followed their recommendation, imposing death plus additional long terms for rape and criminal deviant conduct. In fact, the court also gave 2 consecutive 50-year terms for the sexual offenses. With that sentence, Indiana confirmed it reserved its harshest punishment for what it viewed as the most brutal crime. But the verdict was not the last word. Legal challenges lay ahead, and Ward's fight would not end with the gavel. The sentence was final in name, but the legal journey to execution would prove far from simple. After the conviction, Ward and his legal team initiated appeals, post-conviction petitions, and constitutional challenges. Courts considered whether trial errors occurred, whether Ward's rights were respected, and whether the method of execution itself was lawful. During this period, Indiana's broader death penalty system grappled with major obstacles. The state paused execution for years due to drug shortages and legal scrutiny of lethal injection protocols. Ward's case remained in limbo partly because the state could not reliably procure execution drugs. At times, the Indiana Court of Appeals voided parts of the state's lethal injection protocol, sending ripples of uncertainty through capital cases. Ward himself filed suits to block executions and to argue that Indiana's death penalty system was unconstitutional or arbitrary. Over 20 years passed. The Payne family waited. The public watched, and Ward's lawyers pressed each avenue permitted by law. One thing was clear: the path from death sentence to execution would not be swift or smooth. In 2025, after decades of delay, Indiana's highest court would finally move to schedule Ward's execution and would reopen a flood of last-minute legal battles. In July 2025, the Indiana Supreme Court tentatively set October 10, 2025, as the execution date for Ward. Later in August, it denied his latest appeal and finalized that date. The court rejected arguments about execution method risks and found Ward had not met the burden to reopen his case. The Indiana Parole Board scheduled clemency hearings, an interview at the prison on September 19th, followed by a public hearing in Indianapolis on September 22nd. Ward's defense raised mitigating factors, including a recent diagnosis of autism, and urged mercy. The Payne family, in poignant testimony, called for no leniency for the one who destroyed Stacy's life. Governor Mike Braun held the final power of clemency. With public pressure mounting, legal options narrowing, and emotions high, the governor faced a moment that would decide whether the execution would be carried out. The governor's decision would determine whether Ward would live or die, and the final hours would be watched with agony by families on both sides. As the sun dipped below the horizon in Michigan City, Indiana, a tense stillness settled over the Indiana State Prison. Outside its iron gates, a growing crowd gathered, activists, faith leaders, and grieving citizens standing shoulder to shoulder under flickering candlelight. Their voices rose not in anger, but in sorrow, a unified cry against what they called a cycle of death. The death penalty protests had been organized by Death Penalty Action and the Indiana Abolition Coalition, groups known nationwide for challenging executions across the United States. Holding signs that read "Stop State Killing" and "Justice, Not Revenge," they prayed, sang hymns, and begged for mercy in Roy Lee Ward's case. Among them were church leaders, human rights advocates, and law students who saw Roy's execution as a test of compassion in a system often criticized for its finality. A priest read a passage from the Gospel of John: "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." For a moment, even the night air seemed to pause. Inside the prison, the hum of fluorescent lights and the shuffle of guards signaled a different kind of silence. The clemency appeal had already been denied. The death warrant stood firm. Outside, the crowd continued to pray, unaware that the clock was already ticking toward midnight, and that within those concrete walls, the final preparations for Roy Lee Ward's execution had quietly begun. In the early hours of October 10th, 2025, the state of Indiana moved forward with the execution. The process began shortly after midnight. Roy Lee Ward was pronounced dead at 12:33 a.m. at the Indiana State Prison in Michigan City. His last meal was from Texas Corral and included a hamburger. His last words, as reported, were, "Brian is going to read them." It is unclear precisely when during the process he spoke them, but they stand as the final statement tied to his name. Among those watching, Stacy Payne's family felt both sorrow and relief. Their voices, once echoing in courtroom halls, had waited more than 2 decades for this moment. Ward's attorneys, many hours earlier, had tried everything permitted by law to delay, but all were denied. The governor had refused clemency. The courts would issue no stay. With his execution, the Roy Lee Ward Indiana death row story reached its tragic conclusion. But the legacy remains. Questions about death penalty policy, execution methods, justice for victims, and how long society should carry the weight of punishment. The truth now lies in memory. But as Indiana moves forward, the cost of closing this chapter will echo in every discussion about crime, mercy, and what justice really demands.